Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Keith Harrison. I am originally from Cassopolis, born and raised there. My mother, for instance, was born here about 96 years ago in Vandalia. Although I don't live in the area anymore, I've been out in the area for well over 30 years. I'm a member of the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, which are the descendants of Civil War veterans. I'm also a Civil War reenactor for the last 30 years. And we have a small display out there that I think you really need to see, because this year in particular, we have the 102nd U.S. Colored Troops, which which I mentioned in my presentation, have a historical connection with Cass County. And I think it's important for you to know, everyone to realize that. Michigan itself made a substantial contribution to the preservation of the Union during the American Civil War. While we were far removed from the fighting, we supplied a large number of troops to the war effort. In fact, at the beginning of the war, when Michigan was asked to supply one regiment, then Governor Austin Blair provided 7. Upon the arrival of Michigan's first volunteer regiment into Washington, it is said that President Abraham Lincoln said, "Thank God for Michigan." In addition to the approximately 600 men who joined the Union Navy, Michigan raised 34 regiments of infantry, 1 regiment of sharpshooters, 11 cavalry regiments, 1 engineering regiment, and numerous other smaller independent units. Just over 87,000 Michigan men, or nearly a quarter of the state's male population in 1860, participated in the Civil War. Of the 87,000 plus soldiers that Michigan provided, 1,388 came from Cass County. Michigan's per capita contribution to the war was approximately 12% of its total population. Cass County's per capita contribution accounted for about 8%. Casualties, however, were a little bit different. Of the soldiers Michigan provided, 16.9% of them died in service, as compared to 18.6% from Cass County. Of these, the majority of Michigan's casualties, or 56%, died as casualties from disease, followed by combat deaths of 30.1%, prisoners of war deaths at 8.6%, and then others, including accidental deaths, at 5.3%. Cass County's military deaths on a per capita basis were higher than that of the states in terms of combat deaths. Was 34.8% versus 30.1%. And deaths from other causes, including accidents, 6.3% from Cass County versus the state's 5.3%. Cass County served in 52 different military organizations during the Civil War. The majority of these organizations, or 37 of them, were based in Michigan-based, included 23 infantry regiments, 9 cavalry regiments, 2 artillery, 1 regiment each of engineers and mechanics and sharpshooters. And then in addition to that, the Michigan units, you had Cass County soldiers also served in 3 regiments from Ohio, including 2 infantry regiments and 1 artillery regiment, 3 regiments from Illinois, and 1 infantry regiment from Indiana. And then also 9 United States regiments, which are basically federal. By the end of the war, of the 1,388 Cass County soldiers that served, 258 died, 871 mustered out of service, 153 were discharged for disability, 93 were discharged by order, and 3 had deserted, and 5, there's no further record of them. We have no idea what happened to them. The first demonstration made in Cass County towards taking part in the armed protection of the Union was made at Dowagiac by the Cass County Guards on April 22, 1861, at which time the elected officers, quote, voted to drill every Saturday afternoon until accepted in the service of the state, unquote, and then passed a resolution in favor of publishing the proceedings of their meetings, quote, in the Dowagiac Daily Union and other papers in the county friendly to the Stars and Stripes, unquote. The company that they went into eventually became a portion of the Illinois Regiment. Initially, they were assigned to the 4th Michigan Regiment, which was in the process of forming in Adrian, which then was subsequently changed to the 6th. But before they could report, the officers were ordered to Detroit for military schooling, and the privates were ordered to go home. An effort was made to have these orders rescinded, but to no avail. And refusing to comply with the governor's requirement, the members of that company, by unanimous vote, decided to offer themselves for enlistment in the Douglas Brigade that was organizing then in Chicago. The brigade was not mustered in time until after the First Battle of Bull Run, and the Cass County Company, which had gone to Chicago in June, still had to return home. But finally, on July 26, 1861, 60 men from Cass County were mustered in at Dowagiac by Captain Webb, the United States mustering officer, as Company E of the 42nd Illinois Volunteer Infantry, and then left Chicago. That particular regiment was engaged the enemy 17 times in Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. It was eventually transferred in the spring of 1864 to the Trans-Mississippi Department and remained on duty until December 16, 1865, when it was finally mustered out in Texas. While Cass County soldiers served in 52 different military organizations, there were primarily 5 which the majority of Cass County men joined, they being the 6th, the 12th, and 19th Michigan Volunteer Infantries, the 1st Michigan, which later became the 102nd United States Colored Troops, and the 1st Michigan Cavalry. Company D of the 6th Michigan Infantry was organized in Dowagiac by Charles E. Clark, who was captain. The 6th was known as the Camp of Instruction Regiment. It was organized in the summer of 1861 and rendezvoused in Kalamazoo. Commissioned officers were selected by the governor, and they in turn selected the non-commissioned officers of the respective companies. And then both the commissioned and non-commissioned officers went into a camp of instruction at Fort Wayne, where they were thoroughly drilled for 2 months. The regiment finally left Kalamazoo for Baltimore August 30th, 1861, with 944 officers and men, and remained there for nearly 6 months on garrison duty. On February 22nd, the regiment went to Newport News, and on the 4th of March left with other regiments for New Orleans. The 6th Michigan Infantry was one of the first Union regiments that occupied New Orleans. On the 9th of May, the regiment with its brigade proceeded up the Mississippi, taking possession of many other various Confederate cities. And finally, after a remarkable service, the regiment finally came north at the close of the war, was paid off and discharged at Jackson, Michigan on September 5th, 1865. The 6th, in terms of times it faced the enemy, 21 different times in Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Alabama. The regiment with the largest number of Cass County men was the 12th Michigan Volunteer Infantry with 277. Company A, raised by Captain Joseph Harper of Cassopolis, who was my great-great-great-great-grandfather, was composed almost entirely of Cass County men from Cass County. They were enlisted in Cassopolis in the fall of 1861, and the regiment was organized in Niles, which was the selected place for rendezvous by the 12th Michigan Regiment in the spring of 1862. Captain Van Riper from LaGrange Township was the first lieutenant, and David M. McClellan from Dowagiac was the second lieutenant. The 12th completed its organization and was mustered into service March 5, 1862, with a strength of 1,000 officers and men. The regiment moved from Niles on the 18th of March, taking route to St. Louis, from where it was hurried forward by steamer by the Mississippi, Ohio, and Tennessee rivers, reaching Pittsburgh Landing in time to take part in the Battle of Shiloh, which was fought in that place on the 6th and 7th of April. The colonel commanding that regiment was Francis Quinn of Niles. The regiment was assigned to Colonel Peabody's brigade of General Prentice's division, and was one of the first regiments attacked by the enemy and suffered a major loss. The Battle of Shiloh was an important event in the history of the 12th Michigan. At 3 a.m. on April 6th, 3 companies of the 25th Missouri and 2 from the 12th Michigan were sent out on picket duty. Within a short time, they collided head-on with the entire rapidly advancing Confederate Army, which was making a dawn attack on the Union forces. Firing broke out almost immediately, and shortly before 6 a.m., casualties began flowing back into the 6th Division's camp. The rest of the 12th was in camp preparing breakfast when the drums started beating the long roll. The men strapped on their belts and cartridge boxes and grabbed their Austrian muskets, barely have enough time to form a line of battle. Volley after volley were exchanged between the Confederate Army and the 6th Division, taking a toll on both armies. The whole 6th Division line finally caved in as the rebels swarmed through the trees in a wild bayonet charge, overlapping both Federal flanks. And this was at the same time while Confederate artillery was also sweeping through the Union ranks. So they're getting hit on both sides and in the center. Some of the 12th Michigan men panicked and ran for the river in safety, but most stayed to fight. Those who did wound up separated. Some with Colonel Graves of the regiment, and the rest with General Prentice. Prentice led his portion of the shaken division to a position along a narrow dirt road which formed a critical section in front and a hinge on which two Union battle lines rested. This position later became known as the Hornet's Nest. Here they stayed, repulsing charge after charge until 5:30 p.m., at which time they were finally forced to surrender. The 12th Michigan lost 200 men, including 83 that were captured with General Prentice in the Hornet's Nest. It would be weeks before the regiment was again an effective force. Controversy abounded with charges of cowardice. Included in this was the 12th Michigan's Colonel, Francis Quinn, who had shot himself in the hand the night before, and who the officers and men widely believed had deserted them when the shooting started. Following the battle, in fact, over half the company's captains resigned in protest in disgust of Quinn's actions. Quinn protested his innocence, of course, but to no avail, and finally resigned his commission August 31st, 1862, returning home to Niles, really a broken man. Once reorganized, the 12th went on to participate in battles in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas. And then the regiment, for some time after the close of the war, engaged in guarding public property in Arkansas, but came north in February 1866, and on March 6th, the men were paid off and discharged at Jackson, Michigan. The total membership of the regiment over its lifetime was 2,325 officers and men. Its losses were 432, of which one officer and 23 men died of wounds. 28 men were killed in action, including three officers and 377 men died of disease. The next three regiments with the largest number of Cass County men included the 19th Michigan Volunteer Infantry with 129, the 1st Michigan Regiment, later the 102nd United States Colored Troops with 112, and the 1st Michigan Cavalry Regiment with 110. Company A of the 19th Michigan was composed almost of wholly Cass County men, although there were others in the remaining companies in the regiment. His first lieutenant, George T. Schaefer of Calvin Township, eventually rose to the rank of colonel and later brevet brigadier general, the only individual from Cass County to achieve that rank. Recruiting for the regiment was started July 15, 1862. The camp of the 19th was in Dowagiac. The Honorable Henry C. Gilbert was its commandant in charge of the organization of the regiment. The regiment broke camp September 14th in the command of Colonel Gilbert and took its route to Cincinnati, its strength being at that time 995 officers and men. It was attached to the 1st Division of the Army of the Ohio and was stationed in Kentucky from October through December of 1862. On the 1st of January 1863, the regiment was stationed at Dansville, Kentucky, and then belonged to Colonel Gilbert's brigade, Baird's Division of the Army of Kentucky. The 19th moved with this brigade to Nashville, Tennessee, where it arrived February 7th, and then proceeded to Franklin, Tennessee. And on the 4th of March, 600 cavalry and 200 additional infantry took part with its brigade in a reconnaissance of force. After a march of 4 miles, skirmishing began with the enemy's scouts and the advanced pickets, but the rebels were eventually forced to retire. That particular skirmish, the 19th lost one wounded soldier, and that was not that bad. The next day, however, they met again, and they met them this time in force at Thompson Station, 9 miles from Franklin. The 19th and others fought stubbornly against immense odds, repulsing again attack after attack, struggling bravely but without hope. And defeat being inevitable, they finally had to surrender. At times, the contest was severe and fighting terrific. 3 charges were made by the enemy and gallantly repulsed. One charge, the 19th, actually captured the colors of the 4th Mississippi and several prisoners. The surrender did not occur, however, until 4 hours after the fighting started. The rebel force turned out to be the entire cavalry force of Bragg's army, 18,000 strong, under General Van Dorn, so greatly outnumbered them. During the battle, the 19th went into action with 572 officers and men, of which a large number were either killed or wounded. Such literally was their baptism of fire that they received. The regiment was reorganized at Camp Chase, Ohio, and on the 8th of June, 1863, left Columbus, arriving at Nashville on the 11th. Early in July, The regiment was then ordered to go to Murfreesboro and went into garrison duty with the fortifications down there. From that time until the close of the war, the 19th took part in 12 engagements in Tennessee, Georgia, and North Carolina. The entire regiment was composed, the entire membership of the regiment was 1,238 officers and men, of which 129 from Cass County. The regiment lost a total of 237 men, with 4 officers and 50 men killed in action, 3 officers and 38 men dying in wounds, and 142 dying of disease. In July 1863, Governor Austin Blair was authorized by the Secretary of War to organize one regiment infantry composed of colored men. Henry Barnes of Detroit was authorized then by Governor Blair to raise this infantry regiment. Recruiting commenced August 12, 1863, and the 1st Michigan was then mustered into service as the 102nd United States Colored Troops, or USCT, at its rendezvous point in Detroit, February 17, 1864, with an enrollment of 895 officers and men, including 112 from Cass County. The newly mustered 102nd left the state March 28, 1864, for Annapolis, Maryland, where it was joined the 9th Corps. It was soon detached and sent by transport to Hilton Head, South Carolina, where it arrived on April 19th. During the next 2 months, the different companies from the regiment were on picket duty. 673 men and officers, which it lost 128 men, 5 being killed in action, 7 dying of wounds, 116 dying of disease, and in addition to that, 114 were discharged for disability. It was finally mustered out on September 30th, 1865 in Charleston, South Carolina. It then went to Detroit, Michigan, where it was paid off and disbanded October 17th, 1865. The last regiment was the company that Michigan was involved, or Cass County was involved in, was Company M of the 1st Michigan Regiment Volunteer Cavalry. Although the 1st Michigan Cavalry commenced recruiting August 21st, 1861 at Camp Lyon near Detroit. The work of the organization being carried on by Thornton Broadhead, who later, of course, became the colonel. The 1st was mustered into service September 13th, 1861, with 1,144 officers and men on its roll, including 110 from Cass County. On the 29th, it left Camp Lyons in order to proceed to Washington and then to camp at Fredericks, Maryland, where it spent a considerable portion of the war. After a winter of grand guard duty of Washington, in front of Washington, the 1st Cavalry was then assigned to the Michigan Cavalry Brigade under General George Armstrong Custer, and its services from that point on were chiefly rendered with the Michigan Brigade. The regiment was engaged in 17 times in Virginia and Maryland. After the surrender of Lee in April 65, the brigade moved to Petersburg, Virginia, then to North Carolina, and then to Washington to participate in the Grand Review in May of 1865. It then was sent to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where most of the soldiers were mustered out, but not all of them. The remaining men were then sent to Utah, and they were finally mustered out in 1866. As I mentioned earlier, we had one individual from Cass County who actually rose to the rank of Brigadier General. Again, his name was George Thomas Schaefer from Calvin Township. He was 39 years old. He enlisted August 2nd, 1862 at Dowagiac, and part of the 19th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. He was promoted to captain and then to major, and then was assigned to, or actually went to the 28th Michigan Volunteer Infantry, where he was then promoted to lieutenant colonel, and then to colonel, and then finally to brevet brigadier general of volunteers on May 13, 1865, for gallant and meritorious service at the battles before Atlanta, Georgia, and Wise Fork, North Carolina. He was mustered out June 5, 1866, in Raleigh, South Carolina. We also had one colonel, Charles Edward Clark, a full colonel. Again, from Dowagiac, he enlisted at 40 years of age on June 19, 1861, but he enlisted at Fort Wayne in Detroit. He initially was commissioned as the captain of Company D, 6th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. He later went on to be promoted to lieutenant colonel, and following the war, he was discharged after receiving the rank of colonel. He was discharged, however, in September 7, 1865. Following the war, and this is the only one that I'm aware of that did this, He was then commissioned as a captain, and it sounds a little strange going from colonel to captain, but the war's over, and they reduced the size of the Union Army, and therefore they also reduced the ranks. But he was commissioned as captain on July 28, 1866, in the 38th United States Infantry. He was then promoted to major by brevet, and then served out his term. He retired from the United States Army on June 28, 1878. We also had several majors. All of these, however, were surgeons, and that was a major. Major was the equivalent rank for a surgeon. William E. Clark from Dowagiac, 4th Michigan Volunteer Infantry, and then later the 19th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. He resigned July 18, 1863. Another surgeon, Alonzo Garwood from Cassopolis, became a surgeon in the Army August 15, 1864, in with the 28th Michigan Volunteer Infantry, and he was mustered out June 5th, 1866. A third sergeant, Sylvester Morris from Dowagiac, joined September 3, 1863 in the 5th Michigan Volunteer Cavalry, promoted as surgeon, that'd be the major, and then he resigned his commission July 28, 1864. And then the company commanders, which were captains. We had 8 of those. Captain David W. Clemmer, he was from Dowagiac, 24 years old, enlisted August 12, 1861, with the 1st Michigan Volunteer Cavalry. He was mustered out December 14, 1864. One assistant surgeon, volunteer infantry. He is also listed as a prisoner of war following the Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia, and he was confined in a prison in Macon, Georgia. He was exchanged, however. He re-enlisted in February 16, 1864. He at that time was promoted to first lieutenant and then to captain, and he was finally mustered out of service on December 16, 1865. Roland C. Dennison from Dowagiac, 39 years old, enlisted August 12, 1861. In the 1st Michigan Volunteer Cavalry, he resigned April 26, 1863. Harvey Dew from Niles, actually from Cass County, portion of Niles, 21 years old, started off as a corporal, eventually rose to the rank of captain in the 2nd Michigan Volunteer Infantry. He resigned his commission November 14, 1864. Captain James Ellis, 25 years old, from Dowagiac, commissioned June 19, 1861, with the 6th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. He resigned his commission July 19, 1864. A chaplain, which was equivalent to the captain, John Fletcher from Edwardsburg. He joined August 23, 1864 in the 9th Michigan Volunteer Infantry, and he was mustered out of service July 21, 1865. And the oldest individual, which is my grandfather, Captain Joseph Harper from Cassopolis, he enlisted at 55 years of age. He enlisted on September 26, 1861 as the captain of Company A, 12th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. He was mustered December 19, 1861, and he resigned due to disability May 7, 1862, again, very, very shortly after the Battle of Shiloh. So it's the age for enlistees was basically 18 to 45. The fact he even got in at 55 was highly, highly unusual. So that gives you an overview of the men that were involved in the Civil War from Cass County in particular. One other aspect that most people don't realize is that after the Civil War, the veterans came back. And an organization was created called the Grand Army of the Republic, which was composed of Union veterans. And there were over 463 posts in Michigan alone, over 10,000 posts across the country, 9 of which were in Peru, Brazil, and Canada. It was the first major veterans organization in the country. Cass County had 11 GAR posts, and many of the veterans that fought in the Civil War joined those posts. It was a major social organization for the men, but they also did a lot of good work too in terms of a lot of laws. So on a national basis, little things like you got a flag flying in the schoolyards. That's a direct result of the Grand Army. The fact you had a push for veterans' rights, in particular for black veterans' rights, it's the Grand Army. And then another one that most people don't realize, the right for women to vote was pushed by the Grand Army of the Republic. The Grand Army basically was a huge political organization. Virtually every northern state legislature was composed of veterans and members of the Grand Army of the Republic, and Congress was composed a good share of members and veterans of the Grand Army. Basically, they were so powerful that they helped elect 5 United States presidents. And as the Grand Army eventually died out and other people came in that were not members, because unfortunately the Grand Army did a lot of good things, they also did a lot of bad things in terms of the laws and everything. And what happened was that as they died out, a lot of the laws were changed. And if you look at what roles current veterans organizations have right now and how political they can or cannot be, it's all resulting from the Grand Army. They kind of sort of ruined it for the future veterans organizations, is what happened. But again, at the same time, they did an awful lot. And that's partly, again, the Sons of Union veterans basically were descendants of the Civil War soldiers, and the Grand Army itself created us in 1881 to help carry on their name. So, and that's basically what we do by presentations, by living histories, whatever it may be. So, have any questions? I know I gave you a lot of facts and figures, so I apologize for that. Yes? The Cass County Civil War, yes, at some point. I just found out I'm missing one member from the 102nd, so I'm just adding that today. And that's just it. I said in some of those places, 5 people were unknown. We don't know what happened to them. And luckily for Union records is much better than Confederate records, so the better chance that we might get some information. But ultimately, yes, that's the intent. That's one of the lesser units of the 52 that I mentioned that Cass participated in. That's one of them, and they were from the Pokagon area. And I didn't know that. I just found that out a little while ago from an individual who is an expert in Company K. Because Company K was composed of all Indians, 4 different tribes. And Andersonville, they were in Andersonville too.
I just recently watched a public TV special on what the aftermath of the battles,
Mm-hmm.
and they talked about how so many of the Confederate soldiers, they didn't have any records of deaths and that kind of thing, so the people at home had no idea what happened to the soldiers.
Yes and no. A lot of the units, especially from Virginia, the record keeping was actually pretty darn good from both sides, because both are doing record keeping exactly the same way, just how they were taught out of West Point. And there was an established Army procedure for keeping records, and the Confederacy just adopted that same thing. So the records were pretty good. What's basically happened with a lot of them is that if an entire company was decimated, then, and the company clerk was gone, that's who held the records. Or if the company lost their records, then you've lost all those records. Also, too, I know there was a major fire, I believe, in Virginia, which burned up an awful lot of records at the turn of the century.
Now, did they have any identification that they carried with them, like dog tags now?
Not officially. Yes, they did have some individuals did in fact have what we refer to as dog tags, but not anywhere elaborate. They may have had their name and the company that they belonged to, but they were made by them or purchased by from a sutler. And a sutler was individuals who made their business going around selling stuff to the soldiers that they wouldn't get from the United States. You know, like sweets, pickles, whatever it may be. But some of them actually had name tags that they would try to inscribe, and then the soldiers would buy it. Another thing, it's not exactly 100% true across the board, but some soldiers literally would, in fact, pin their name on their uniform. So if they're killed, at least their name's on the uniform. But again, none of this was across the board, for North or South. So in that sense, that's the reason we do have a lot of unknowns. But it's amazing how many knowns that we have.
I know when you were talking about that, I was pretty surprised.
Yeah.
You had so many records of the soldiers.
Yeah, it's amazing. It was pretty darn good record keeping for the time frame. You figure it's all done by hand.
Because I know in that piece they talked about President Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation, and 160,000 black soldiers went into the Union Army,
Right.
and a lot of them got the details, the garbage details, to go to the battlefields and bury soldiers.
And initially that was the case. As I mentioned, even for the 102nd, they were initially put on fatigue duty. But as time went on, they certainly proved themselves. With no question about it. They were a major fighting organization, and so a lot of minds were changed back then. But that's history, unfortunately.
They never had the same amount of equipment that the government provided, let's say the white soldiers
Yeah.
as the black. So
They-
they were without shoes or without socks.
But in some instances, the other thing too, they didn't get the same pay.
That's right. They got 1/3.
Yeah, they got 1/3 of pay.
They got 1/3 of that.
So I mean, yeah, there was still that.
If they got it, many times the captain or somebody would said, okay, you signed off on it, they may not even have got the pay.
Yeah, and that's another one of my ancestors was a member of the 60th United States Colored Troops. He was a white lieutenant, white first lieutenant, but he was stationed, and they were almost all on guard duty, and they were over in Missouri. So but again, for the 102nd. No, they got that, and of course the major one that I think everyone realizes is 54th Massachusetts. That's been really highly publicized in terms of what they did. But the 102nd did their share too, and that's the reason it's so important to have the 102nd here, because of their significance to Cass County. Additional questions?
He mentioned emancipation, 1850, and then Civil War, 1860. Many of the African